The financial secretary is the one responsible for recording and receiving the funds that's been given to the church by the gracious givers. As we begin to think about the financial secretary, we understand that the financial secretary will oversee the counting of the money and may assist in the counting of the money, but we want to be absolutely certain they do not do it by themselves. The financial secretary will work with the committee designated counters. We talked about that earlier, but remember the committee will appoint who the designated counters are, and they'll work under the direction of the financial secretary to receive the funds, whether it's right after church or whether it's sometime during the week when the mail is open to receive the funds. They make sure that the money is received, that it's credited to the right fund in which it's going to be spent, if it's designated or restricted, or if it's unrestricted, that it's also recorded that way, and then the financial secretary is responsible for the givings records. Now we also got to remember the financial secretary shall be bonded. The discipline doesn't give us any decision on that. They shall be bonded, and under a blanket bond they are. So if you're not in the conference insurance plan, as we talked earlier, be sure you get them listed on that financial bond. The financial secretary should use at least 2 people to count the money and not of the immediate family. Now the financial secretary then receives the counting, and the financial secretary could be one and one other person, but it's got to be at least 2 or more counting the funds, and use what you need to make the system move faster. Then the financial secretary takes that listing of deposits and gives everybody credit on their giving records. So the deposit's made up by the 2 people counting the money, it's sent on to the bank, and then the financial secretary records what it's given for, what it's designated to, and make sure that the record of the donor is complete so that we can then thank the folks for their givings and make sure that we're living into putting the money in the location that they designate for it to go. Now you could use offering envelopes, which really works well to have those offering envelopes, but normally if there's a check in the offering envelope, you don't have to worry too much about the envelope itself. But if somebody chooses to give cash in an offering envelope and they note who they are that's giving that money, it's not to determine that we know how much they gave, it's more to be able to say thank you for your gift. Now, you want to verify the amount that's on the outside of that envelope, that it matches on what's actually in it, and keep up with the name or number so that you can give them records. Make sure you got a secure place for counting. You don't want to just grab the offering plate, sit down on the front pew, and count the money. People will be walking by looking at the money, what are the checks made out to. They'll just be kind of tending to business they don't need to tend to. So take the money, go to a secure place, and then follow through a process. I suggest having some type of count sheet. How many ones, how many fives, how many tens, how many nickels, dimes, quarters did we get? List the checks that we received. Now, if you're in a larger church, you may want to make copies of those checks. That's really easier to do it that way, and then you've got the copies. You can attach it to your copy of the deposit slip, and you got an excellent record to record those at a later time. But if you are going to list the checks and not make copies, be sure you list the check number and the person's name so that your record of the giving can be complete. Make sure you put a restrictive endorsement on the back of those checks for deposit only to account 123 of the ABC Church or something in that line, so that should something happen to that deposit on the way to the bank, no one else can receive that money. The only thing you really stand to lose is the cash. Now there's one piece that came into the 2016 discipline that is very, very, very important. I just can't tell you how important it is to live into this. Pastors have access to the givings records. You cannot restrict them from seeing the givings records, but pastors may decide how they want to see those records. Do they want to actually see the records themselves? Do they want their financial secretary to say that this group of people are giving consistently? You know, it's that way that the pastor and the financial secretary will work out so that they live inside of paragraph 340.2c, so that they are sure that they're living into the discipline. The pastor is able to see those records and they get that taken care of. Now, the importance of the pastor seeing the records is simply this. I think the easiest way to say it is this. I don't want somebody operating, caring for the money of the church or the responsibility of the church when they don't have a stake in it. So why would I want someone serving as chair of the admin council or chair of the missions committee or chair of the benevolence committee that are just not giving any money to the church? If I've got a stake in what I'm doing, I'm more apt to care for it better and see that the work is done. So pastor needs to know who's giving to the church. If they're not giving, then really nominations committee needs to take a second thought as to nominations. The other piece is not for the pastor to be able to say, well, you know, I've got to just be really nice to these folks because they give a whole lot of money. That's not the concept. The concept is, if somebody is giving a lot of money and all of a sudden they quit giving money, that's the first sign there's a problem. People won't tell you there's a problem. They'll say, I'll just quit giving and see how they do without my money. If the pastor knows a person's gone from giving $500 a week to giving $5 a week, something's wrong. It's either they're upset over something that's happened, or maybe they've had a financial setback in their home. Maybe there's someone sick in the home that they're having to spend that money that was coming to the church on illness expenses. And so you see, we track that to be able to know where there's need in the church, because everybody has needs at times, and normally the financial receipts will help you understand when people either have a problem that's happening out there that they're trying to care for, or they're upset over something. Either one still affects the church, and the pastor needs to be aware of it. So don't tell the pastor they can't have access to the givings records. Paragraph 340.2c is where you need to look at that. When you think about your cash receipts, deposit daily. Don't let money sit around the church. If something happened, somebody broke in, if there was a fire, if there was a windstorm, if there was a hurricane, everything got blown away, how would you even know where to begin to put together the checks that you had? So if I deposit daily, that means the money is in the bank. If I deposit intact means as I receive it, how I receive it. So on Sunday morning, if there's 10 fives in the offering plate, and somebody comes by and says, hey, I'm fixing to go to so-and-so, can you cash a check for me? Say, no, I'm sorry. Our internal control policy says we have to deposit the money intact. Because if somebody looks at the deposit and sees there were no fives deposited on a specific day, that they know they gave 10 $5 deposits, that creates suspicion. And people are going to say, see there, I gave $50 to the church and it didn't even make it to the bank. You want to be careful in what you're doing. Be sure the counters provide their report to the financial secretary if you're not there, to the treasurer, and if you have an internal audit function, to them. We want to be sure that what we received in the offering plate is what actually got into the bank and is what people were given credit for. Either mail or drop that deposit off at the bank, not by the one maintaining the accounting records. When you think about it, if I'm maintaining the accounting records and you hand me the deposit and I take it to the bank and I take the $20 out of it to go eat lunch on, we talked about earlier, take it out of there, I can change that deposit and nothing will look any different. Whereas if whoever is receiving the money and responsible for counting and getting the deposit made, put it into a drop envelope so that I can take it to the bank and drop it in the bank, then if something's off at that point, I can look for it and determine who had custody of the deposit when something happened. So be sure that you drop it off or mail it to the bank and not the person that's keeping the accounting records. And never cash checks payable to the church. Don't say to the janitor, oh, we don't have enough cash to pay you today, so here, I'm going to take this check from Mr. John Doe, and on the back of it I'm going to say, pay to janitor by First United Methodist Church, and give it to the janitor to go cash. If I did that, then what would stop the person that gave that check from looking on the back and saying, why did you give my money to the janitor? I gave that to the church. So if we're just certain that everything we receive goes to the bank just as we receive it, we write checks out to pay expenses, and we make sure that the records are handled by different folks, we'll be living inside those internal controls. And we're absolutely certain then that we've been able to account for the gracious gifts. Now, on the other side of that, we've got to maintain those contribution records simply to say thank you. Remember, 6 or 7 times saying thank you is what we want to do, because we want people to know we are thankful for what they gave. But we also want to be certain that we live inside of those IRS requirements, that we give people receipts for any individual check for $250 or more. We want to give notice to our members periodically. I suggest at least quarterly, send out a notice to say and send out the notice in this way. Write a letter, maybe the Sunday school superintendent, the daycare director, maybe the older adult ministry, writes a letter and says, during the past quarter we were able to do the following ministries and these things happened in the church, and just tell a nice story about what happened and conclude with, and on the back of this letter is what you gave to that ministry. We want you to know we give thanks for your generosity to the ministry of our church. Put it on the back. What you're doing then is you're telling the story of how their money made a difference, thanking them for what they gave, and then encouraging them to give more because they trust the leadership, they see the money's going where they said for it to go, and they know they're making a difference in people's lives. So remember that as you're working along. Once you get these letters made up, maintain copies of the notices sent to the members. Had an opportunity one time, a person came in and said, I need a copy of my giving records. I'm getting audited by the IRS. So the financial secretary said, well, I don't have copies of them. Let me just write you another one. So they wrote another one, and they dated it the day they wrote it, which was about 3 years after the fact. The person took it to the IRS auditor, and the auditor simply said, this is great. I'm so thankful that you give to your church, but I can only have contemporaneous records. This was written yesterday. I need the one that was written 3 years ago. And he explained that they didn't have any. And she said, well, then you don't get the contribution to the church as a deduction on your tax return. So you see, it's important we do everything in the right order, in the right time, and maintain copies of what we've done so that we can help those members of the church when they're needing those information for their tax records. Now, the rest of that story, as Paul Harvey used to say, was that person had given over $50,000 to the church that year. When that deduction couldn't be proven, that person left that church and went to another church in which, as he stated, he could trust to do things right. It's awfully hard to lose a $50,000 contribution to a church and replace it. So let's do things the way they're supposed to be done. Anytime there's a difference in the deposit, the internal audit committee may ask you, now wait a minute, you said you deposited $986 and the bank shows $936. Can you look at your copy and my copy and tell me what's different? And it might be we listed a check as $150 when it was really $100, or maybe our writing looked like $150 instead of $100. But we need to be able to account for any differences, and we should be able to do that on a monthly basis when we reconcile the bank account. So keep those items in mind as you work through. Remember, your job is to receive the funds from the gracious givers that gave to the church, they gave to God through your church, and you account for it properly so that trust is developed and people want to continue to give to make differences in people's lives. Your job is to get it and get it in the bank so that the finance committee can receive it, manage it, and disperse it accordingly.